Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Every Day is Friday 365. I'm your host, Matthew, and remember to subscribe so you can join me on this journey where every day is Friday. Today, I got a really special guest joining us, Chris. He has spent years asking the hard questions about something that affects us all, our schools. He's been digging into the public school system, and what he has found shocked a lot of people and even me. So today, welcome to the show, Chris.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I think a lot of people are really going to connect with your story and what you've been through and what you've done.
I hope so. I work for Fox 45 News in Baltimore, and I've been an investigative reporter here. I've been an investigative local reporter for most of my career. And, I started here in Baltimore, and we started in January of 2017. And, we're doing something here in Baltimore that's pretty unique in local journalism, where I work on a team called Project Baltimore, and there's 5 of us, and there's 2 photographer editors, 2 producers, and myself as the reporter. And for the past 9 years and 4 months, we've been focused on one topic. And that one topic has been public education. And we started in Baltimore City. We since expanded throughout Maryland. And I wrote my book, Failure Factory, really for the entire country to get a better understanding of how public schools really work, because I know that we're going to be talking about it coming up. But I don't think a lot of people really understand how public education is set up. I didn't. In January of 2017, when I started working at Fox 45, when this book begins, I didn't know a lot about public education. And that's part of the reason, Matthew, that I wrote the book, is because I think my dad was a public school teacher for 35 years. And I figured that if I didn't know these things about public education and how it actually works, a lot of other people don't too.
I'm going to say this because my mom is actually a teacher as well, and she's still teaching to this day. And some of the stuff that she can tell me that happens, it's shocking at sometimes. What was the first moment where you realized something was really wrong with these schools, though?
Well, I think it was before we ever started. So I was an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C. I was working for the ABC News affiliate when this opportunity came up to move to Baltimore. And it was really initiative by our parent company, Sinclair Broadcast Group, which owns the ABC News affiliate in D.C. that I was working for, and also owns Fox 45. And the reason that we chose public education to do this one topic long-term investigative report on is because we could see in federal data that Baltimore City Schools was, and still is, one of the most funded large school systems in America. But we can also see through federal data that is one of the lowest performing large school systems in America. And when we first looked at that, we were trying to answer the questions how and why. So in January of 2017, we're like, okay, why is this happening? But more importantly, how is this happening? How are taxpayers constantly putting more and more and more money into public education? But the educational outcomes for students are not improving. If anything, they're getting worse. Why is this happening? And really, 9 years later, Matthew, is why I wrote Failure Factory, because I think we now know, after doing this every single day of my professional career for 9 years, I think we now have the answers to how and why. And the answers here in Baltimore are the same answers that are in Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Memphis, California, all throughout the entire country, because public education in Baltimore and Maryland, it's largely the same concept in all 50 states.
Well, how can schools get more money but still have worse results?
So that's the main question, right? How can that happen? In when I started in 2017, and I had come from Washington, D.C., I didn't know anybody in Baltimore. And I had already developed a pretty good reputation as an investigative journalist in D.C., Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I was before that. And when I got here, I was trying to meet a lot of people and talk to a lot of people. And I had a lot of people were telling me the same thing. And what they were telling me was public education, if you're really going to dig into this, you're really going to devote your professional life to this, what you're going to find is that public education no longer prioritizes education. It prioritizes the acquisition of funding, and then the usage of that funding to hire more adults for the public education system, which grows as political power and influence. And in 2017, I didn't believe it. Because as I said, my dad was a public school teacher for 35 years. I went to public schools, K through 12. So did my brother. My kids go to public schools. So in January of 2017, I flat out rejected that concept. And what Failure Factory is, what my book is largely my evolution of my pendulum that started here, completely rejecting that concept, to how the pendulum started to swing and swing to the point where it is now, 9 years later, where I just don't think that's true. I know it's true. And what my book is doing is that it's guiding the reader through the evolution that I had before I realized, yeah, all the data in a school system points to one thing, that the schools are focused on acquiring funding, not educating kids. And I can just give you a little bit of the data that kind of led me there that I think is very helpful. In 2017, when the book begins, Baltimore City Schools had a $1.3 billion budget. In 2025, which is the most recent year for which we have data, because 2026 isn't done yet, Baltimore City Schools had a $1.8 billion budget. So it got a $500 million pay increase per year from taxpayers. Comes out to 38%. So in those 8 years, the school system got a 38% increase in funding. Throughout those 8 years, the attendance rate is lower now than it was in 2017. The chronic absenteeism rate is higher now than it was in 2017. The dropout rate is higher now than it was in 2017. The average SAT score is lower now than it was in 2017. The graduation rate in 2017 in Baltimore City Schools was 70%, which by far was the lowest in the state of Maryland. After a 38% pay increase, the graduation rate is 71%. It went up 1 point. 38% funding increase, 1% graduation rate increase. So your taxes went up if you live in Maryland, if you live in Baltimore. You're paying more money to live so that the schools can get more money. In return, the taxpayer and the students are supposed to get a better education. Well, the schools are getting the money, but the education's not following. And why is it not following? Because the focus is on getting the money, not educating the kids.
Where's the money going? I mean, what's one thing that's happening in like public schools right now that would like shock most parents?
The money's going to salaries and benefits for more people. So in 2017, Baltimore City Schools had 10,500 employees. It now has 12,800 employees. It grew by more than 2,000 employees. So more than 2,000 additional adults have been hired to work within the school system. At the same time, enrollment is down. Enrollment's down about 7 to 8%. Roughly 7,500 kids are no longer enrolled in the school system. So you have thousands of additional adults that are working for the school system. You have thousands of fewer students enrolled in the school system. So more money, more adults to educate fewer students. But yet the educational outcomes, most of them are worse now than they were 8 years ago. It's really stunning when you start really digging into this. And the one thing that I want people to know, and the one thing that I really try to focus on in Failure Factory, is I'm trying to show people how to look at this data in your school, in your particular school system. What is the data that you can find that is really going to show you what is happening and how it's happening? And one of the main things that really drives this point home is when I learned this. And that is that a lot of people think that schools get more money or extra money, or there's some sort of incentive when test scores are high or when graduation rates are high, or if they can bring down the chronic absenteeism rate or get more kids in school, increase the attendance rate. People think that school funding is somehow tied to education, and it's not. And this was one of the wow moments for me that really led me to write this book, is when I finally realized that education spending is not dependent upon education. Schools do not get money to educate kids. Schools get money to enroll kids. 100% of the funding that a school gets in Maryland and in many places throughout the country is tied to enrollment. It's not tied to education. So if you're a principal, if you're an administrator, your goal, if you want money, is to enroll as many kids as possible. It doesn't matter if they learn. Now, we all want the kids to learn, and many people inside the school want the kids to learn, but that's not how the money is paid. The money is simply paid to enroll the child. That is it. If you have a school, let's say you got 500 kids in your school, all 500 kids are proficient in English, or 0 of those kids are proficient in English, you get the same amount of money. You get the same paycheck every 2 weeks. Money is not tied to student performance. And that goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of your show, that schools are not focused on educating kids. They're focused on acquiring the funding, so much so that funding has nothing to do with education.
Chris, but if you could change like 3 things in the school system right now, what would it be?
Well, about 20 years ago, Maryland had some of the best schools, actually the best schools in the country, according to EdWeek, US EdWeek. And now we're somewhere in the middle. But what was happening 20 years ago was not what I just talked about. We had a state superintendent had set up an incentive system where if schools achieved certain metrics, growth metrics, that they would get additional funding. So there was an incentive system in Maryland where if a school did really well, it got rewarded for that. So there was an incentive to get your kids to school. There was an incentive to educate them, an incentive to lower chronic absenteeism, to increase the attendance rate. Those incentives were there. They're not there anymore. And now we can see that our schools are significantly lower performing now than they were 20 years ago. Now, this is specific to Maryland, but I think it's also applicable to the entire country. We all run on incentives. There's a reason that, we don't go out and shoot a deer every time we're hungry. We just walk to the kitchen, because the incentive is we're hungry and we can very quickly eat. And that seems like a pretty absurd, thing to talk about, but at the same time, it's true. Like, we drive on incentives. We wake up every morning and go to work because we need money to feed our families. Like, we are an incentive driven type of people, but those incentives don't exist in the public education system. So I think that would be very helpful if the public education system can go back to some sort of incentive structure. Now, that's not to say that you dock pay for teachers that have students that are lower, because that's not fair either. Because if you're a 6th grade teacher and you get a student who's reading at a 1st grade level, that 6th grade teacher should not be penalized for that. However, that 6th grade teacher should be rewarded if that kid goes from a 1st grade reading level to a 5th or 6th grade reading level. But that's what we're not seeing. We're not seeing that incentive mentality to really bring the kids up from where they are. A lot of other things that can happen: discipline inside of schools is really bad. And a lot of that is because the administrators and the principals that are running these schools don't want their schools to look bad on paper. In Failure Factory, I talk a lot. I have an entire chapter devoted to schools manipulating data to make the schools appear safer on paper than they actually are. Not recording suspensions, not recording weapons confiscations, not recording fights. There's even one story that I tell in Failure Factory where I interview a girl who was the victim of a 2nd-degree assault. But, legally, police, legally the victim of a 2nd-degree assault, but the school never documented it because they didn't want a 2nd-degree assault that was tied to their school and documented on paper. These are the types of things that are happening in the school. So if we have an incentive structure, if we have discipline inside the schools, and we have the schools that are not manipulating the data, that would really help go a long way. And the most important aspect of that is that with the discipline inside of the schools, that is tied directly to learning. If you're a teacher, you got 25 kids in your class and one or two of them is acting out, it affects the learning for every other kid. If you talk to teachers we talk to teachers on a regular basis, the main complaint teachers have is the school environment, the lack of discipline in the schools. And why is that happening? It's happening because the money is tied to enrollment. If you suspend a kid or expel a kid, that kid's no longer enrolled. You don't get the money anymore. So the incentive is to keep that kid in the school.
Well, how should parents, that's what I'm thinking, like, how should parents, like, start thinking about differently about their kids' education?
Well, we are seeing this happen all around the country. We are seeing a push in America to offer options to parents. The charter school movement is significant. We're seeing a school choice movement in many states. Arizona 3 years ago passed universal school choice. Florida has universal school choice. The bill that passed last year in Washington, D.C., the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, that has a provision in it that allows for private scholarships for school choice that families can apply for. So we are seeing this movement where the traditional model of public education, many people feel is completely failing. It's a failure factory. And we're seeing these different ways of educating kids, which mostly revolve around parent choice, that parents should largely have a say in how their kids are educated. But in order to get there, you got to have elected officials and politicians that are willing to change the laws to allow the parents to have more options. And that's really what it comes down to, Matthew. It comes down to you need to vote for people that are going to hold the school systems accountable and say, if we're going to give you all this money, if we're going to give you billions of dollars a year, you need to give us a better product, which is a better educated student. And if you're not giving us a better educated student, then we're going to give parents the ability to find a place that will. And that's what's not happening in places like Baltimore and in places like Maryland. The schools are getting the money, but the elected officials are not holding those schools accountable. That is really the main point of this. And in other states like Arizona and Florida that I mentioned, those parents are getting options. Those schools are being held accountable that if you don't educate this kid's no longer going to be enrolled. And then what happens? You don't get your money.
Well, I'm just thinking because of what I've been through with my sports and my band and like after school clubs. I mean, how important is all that to a kid and a student that's going through school as well?
I mean, all that stuff is very important. I was involved in all those extracurricular activities, and in a lot of times in Baltimore, there's a number of schools that don't have stuff like that, and this school system, Baltimore, it gets roughly $24,000 a year per student. It's in the top 5 in the country, probably top 3, might be number 3 in the country when the new census numbers come out because the census calculates this. And there's schools that don't have a lot of extracurricular activities in Baltimore City. And a lot of it has to just do with mismanagement of money. But the problem is those parents can't leave that system. And in Failure Factory, I talk to a lot of them. I talk to the parents who want to get out, but they can't because they don't have the educational or monetary means to do so. And a lot of the parents that I talk to in the book, their kids are being undereducated by the same school system the parent went to. And it becomes this cycle. It's just this cycle of poverty, this cycle of being undereducated. And a lot of it has to do with the parents don't have a way to get out. They can't afford private school. They can't afford Catholic school, parochial school. They can't afford to homeschool. They don't have the education to homeschool their kids. And really they're stuck in these schools, and that's how you see this generational poverty. And that's why it's one of the big problems, I think, of how this is now decades and decades of a problem that America somehow says it can't fix. Well, no, there are solutions. There are solutions that are happening all around the country. The problem is that, and I really do, this is something that I do talk a lot about in the book, is there's so many people making so much money, Matthew, that they don't want the system to change because they're profiting off of it.
if there's so many people at the top controlling the money, I mean, school teachers aren't getting paid like crazy amounts of money.
Well, in Maryland, the starting teacher salary right now is $60,000. So you're 21 years old, you come out of college and you start teaching in Maryland, you're making $60,000. I think that's a lot of money for a 21-year-old coming out of college. It's a lot more than I made. I don't know how much you made when you were like 21 years old, but that's a lot more than I made. And there's a lot of teachers in Baltimore City schools that are pretty good into the six figures. And, they get their summers off. They have really good pensions. They have really good health care. I have never had, and this is honest, I've never had a teacher tell me they didn't think they made enough money. And the reason for that, I think, is because when you become a teacher, you know how much money you're going to make. There's no surprises. You know exactly what the pay scale is. It's right there in front of you. You can see how much money you're going to make year one, how much money you're going to make year 5, year 10, year 20. It's all right there. It's in the collective bargaining agreement. And to say that you didn't make enough money or you don't make enough money seems a bit disingenuous because you know what the deal was when you were going in. We are seeing a teacher shortage in the country. And the teachers that I talk to, it's not because we don't pay teachers enough. It's because teachers don't want to work in the environment that has been created, like we just talked about, where there's a lack of structure in the school. There's a lack of discipline in the school. And you have these situations where the schools aren't focused on educating. The schools are focused on acquiring the money.
Chris, if money isn't fixing the schools, then what actually would?
Accountability, having politicians and having elected officials that would hold the school systems accountable. I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we were starting Project Baltimore in 2017, one of the first main investigations that we did when I got here was because I didn't know anybody. I just started looking at data, and it's what investigative journalists do. We look at data and we try to find stories within giant spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets, and we look for outliers. And what I had done, and I explain all this in Failure Factory in much greater detail, but what I did was I took the state standardized testing that is done in Baltimore City for all 165 schools, math and English. And I grouped it all and I organized it all and I started looking at it all. And what I found was there were 6 schools in Baltimore City that did not have any students proficient in any subject. Hundreds of kids, not one student was proficient in math or English. Not one. That is stunning to even think about. And we did this story, and it was one of our first, if not our first, viral story that we had done. And it got a lot of national attention, as it should. You have 6 schools where not one kid can read or write at grade level is really alarming. And when we did that story, all of the outrage was from outside of Baltimore, not inside of Baltimore. The elected officials inside of Baltimore didn't speak out against it at all. They accepted it. And that's largely why cities like Baltimore, their public education system, remains the way that it is, because the school systems aren't held accountable by the elected officials that take our money and give it to the school system. There's no checks and balances. It's accepted. It's accepted. And as long as it continues to be accepted, it's going to continue to happen. As long as it's acceptable to give a school system $1.8 billion, which is what we talked about city schools got in 2025, but yet 12% of the kids are proficient in math. That's the number. In 2025, 12% of students in Baltimore City were proficient in math. 12. That means 88% of the kids in the city are not proficient in math, and taxpayers are giving that system $1.8 billion a year, a 38% increase over just 8 years ago. But you don't hear the public officials in Baltimore City speaking out against this. You don't hear them saying this is unacceptable. If anything, they find it acceptable. And I'll give you one more example. And yeah, this goes on forever and ever. In last year, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. And when he did that, he gave a speech at the White House. And in that speech, he mentioned one public school system. He mentioned Baltimore, and he mentioned my reporting. And this is all in this book, the reporting that the president mentioned last year, citing why the U.S. Department of Education should be dismantled. It is in Failure Factory. In 2023, we had done a story where we did a very similar data analysis to the one I just mentioned with the 6 schools. But what we found was 40% of the high schools in Baltimore City did not have any students proficient in math. And that's what the president cited last year when he made that speech about dismantling the Department of Education. He mentioned that 40% of the high schools had no student proficient in math. Nearly half of the high schools in Baltimore City could not produce a student who was proficient in math. So when the president mentioned that, there was an uproar. There was an uproar of people outside of Baltimore saying, someone's got to take this school system over. This is completely unacceptable. And there was an uproar inside of Baltimore of people attacking President Trump for pointing it out. They didn't say he was wrong because he's not wrong. That's an actual statistic. But they attacked him for pointing it out. They called him racist. They called him all the things that we do now in America when we disagree with somebody. But it's real and it's true. And when you have 40% of your high schools with no kids proficient in math and your local elected officials, defend it, they not only do they not say this is unacceptable, they defend it. I think that's a large part of the problem.
Well, what role do parents really play in their children's education?
Well, they play a massive role. I mean, it's the most important thing to a kid are their parents. And I get this question a lot, like how much, how do you hold parents accountable for this? And there's a couple ways that you can go about this. So in Failure Factory, I interview a mom. Her name is Michelle Bradley. And I spent about 90 minutes with Michelle. And she lives in abject poverty in Baltimore City, in a really old Section 8 government housing development. The type of development that most people have never been in and don't understand. She lived in the type of development where she didn't control her own thermostat. The government controls the thermostat. She can't even open her windows. The windows are screwed shut. At that type of place. And I interviewed her because she had 2 kids that were going to Baltimore City public schools. And she can't read. So she made it to high school in Baltimore City schools, and she never learned how to read. And later in life, like in her mid to late 30s, she learned that she had dyslexia. And the school system either didn't care to or didn't want to, but they never diagnosed it. But they kept pushing her through the school system. Why? Because as long as she stayed enrolled, they got the money. She didn't have to learn how to read. The school system still gets the money. So I interviewed her because she was really worried about the education that her daughters were getting. And when people ask me about parents, I always think of Michelle Bradley, because I think that if most people would talk to Michelle Bradley, they would understand that you can't hold her accountable. The only thing that you really can do, that she can do, is to make sure that her kids go to school. They're there. But once they're inside of that building, she does not have the educational or monetary means to help her. She can't read. When her kids come home from school, she can't help them with their homework. She can't help them with their reading assignments or their math equations. She can't do that. And it breaks my heart to know that that is happening, but it's real. So the role that parents play is significant, but the parents are not getting $1.8 billion to educate students. The school system is getting $1.8 billion to educate students. And if the school system can't do it, then perhaps they should give the money to somebody else and let them try. And that was the point of what we talked about earlier in places like Arizona and Florida. They are giving the money to other places and letting them try. That's not happening in places like Baltimore. It's not happening in places like Maryland.
Well, I just think
Oh,
about it that the taxpayers are like, they're paying for all the school system. I mean, every taxpayer, I mean, even if you don't even have kids, you're paying for the taxes that go to school systems. So, I mean, like,
yeah.
should schools start focusing on more like real life skills instead of just tests?
Well, you look at a place like Baltimore where 12% of the kids are proficient in math. Yeah, I mean, I think most people would say, focus on teaching these kids math. I mean, these kids need to know how to do math. It's about 30% of the students in Baltimore City are proficient in reading. That's by far the lowest number in the state, which means 70% of the kids in the school system are not proficient in reading. That I think that's where you start. You start focusing on that. But Matthew, it goes back to what I said before. It doesn't matter if those kids read and write at grade level. The school still gets the money. The incentive isn't there. Now, that's not to say that some kids don't learn. They certainly do. It's not to say that there's some teachers and principals that are doing all they can to educate the students. There certainly are. But the incentive for the entire system is not dependent upon the kids learning. It's simply dependent upon the kids enrolling. I mean, so much so that this book I mentioned, Failure Factory, covers 8 years because it came out in 2025. It came out at the end of 2025 and we started in 2017. But 5 years of the book is a grade changing investigation that that we were involved in, where we had to sue Baltimore City Public Schools because they would not give us documents, public documents, and we sued them for violating Maryland's Public Information Act, and we ended up winning. And what we learned was that there's massive grade changing, and we're not talking about B's to A's or C's to B's. We're talking about F's to D minuses, F's to a 60, the lowest possible passing grade. And we found thousands and thousands and thousands of failing grades were being changed to passing with the intent of matriculating the students through the school system and eventually getting them to a high school diploma. Now, you may be asking, why would a school system do that? Why would teachers do that? Well, it's not teachers. The teachers aren't doing it. Administrators are doing it, we learned. Administrators are going into teachers' grade books and they're changing failing grades to passing. Well, why would you do that? Because money is tied to enrollment. And if a student sees a light at the end of the tunnel, that light being a high school diploma, they're more likely to stay enrolled. If the student continues to fail, they're more likely to drop out, and now the school doesn't get the money. And what we had found was there was a state level investigation that followed our lawsuit when we won. And it was the Inspector General for Education in Maryland who found that upwards of 10% of students at some schools were graduating who should not have. Their grades were changed from failing to passing in order to give them a high school diploma. That's where we are in school systems like Baltimore. And that's where we are in school systems throughout Maryland and throughout the entire country, because that's the incentive structure that has been created. The focus is on passing students. The focus is not on educating students. And I know that, in the past 35 minutes or so, we've kind of gone over a lot of stuff here, and it's really overwhelming and it's kind of hard to believe. And in many ways, you don't want to believe it. Like, you don't want to believe the school system is like this, but it's exactly why I wrote Failure Factory, because it is like this. And these are the real life scenarios that are playing out that we talked about in the beginning of your show. I don't think a lot of people really understand, but what we're talking about right now is how the public school system is set up.
You have to ask, like, who invented the school system?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of changes, right? So there's been, since I was in school, I mean, you look like you're a bit younger than me. When I was in school, it wasn't always like this, the way that it is now. And if you just look at the past 30 years, there's been a lot of things that have changed. There's a lot more money going into public education now, a lot more money. And I make the argument in the book that in some cases, have we put too much money into public education? Because what that has done is that has convinced a lot of people to get into that profession, not to help kids, but to acquire the funding. Because if you're a school system and you get $1.8 billion, there's a lot of people that want to get in on that. They want part of that money. And while many teachers and principals still get into public education for the right reasons, I think that there is a growing number that are getting into it because it's a way to acquire wealth. The CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, they don't have a superintendent, it has a CEO, makes $500,000 a year in total compensation. $500,000. 12% of the kids are proficient in math. I mean, kind of wrap your head around this. So you had, and she's been there since 2016. So the entire time that Failure Factory is being written, with the things we talked about, with the lawsuit, 38%, increase in funding, but yet the graduation rate went up 1 point. Grade changing and manipulation of violence data. All these things are happening while someone's making $500,000 a year in total compensation, and it goes back to why? Well, because her funding isn't tied to student outcomes. Her salary isn't tied to student outcomes. Those things don't matter when it comes to how much money a school's getting and how much money individuals within that school system are getting. It's just not.
Chris, like, what's a small change though that could help students?
A small change. I mean, I think that the discipline thing is not that big of a change. You simply hold students accountable for their actions. That would make a significant impact. Another change that would help is, we have this system set up where if you're a principal, it's very difficult to get a bad teacher out of the classroom. We have set up a system that is so dependent upon the acquisition of funding that it protects the adults in many ways over the students. Because if you have a teacher in the classroom, because of the union influence, it makes it very difficult for principals to remove a teacher from the classroom. Well, does that help the kids? No, of course it doesn't help the kids. But the education system does not prioritize education. These are the types of things that I talk about in the book that when you start putting all of it together, like I did over the past 8-9 years, I started to say, hey, my pendulum's over here now. Like there's too many things that are simply showing me that the priorities of the school system it's not the kids, it's the adults. So we have a situation where, and I can speak specifically to Maryland, that the school systems have put massive amounts of money, or have gotten massive amounts of money, massive increases in funding from taxpayers. And the outcomes continue to either be stagnant or go down. Even as enrollment is dropping, they're getting more money to educate fewer students, and we're not seeing the educational outcomes. And I'm not convinced that just putting more money into the public education system is going to improve public education. I think we have 30, 40, 50 years of data to suggest that isn't true. We got 9 years of data in my book, Failure Factory, that is showing you that didn't happen. Baltimore City got a lot more money, $500 million more dollars a year over 8 years, and kids didn't do better. So I don't think that that's the answer. As we talked about before, I think the answer is you have to change the incentive structure. There has to be an incentive for schools to improve the quality of education that they are giving to students. And, we're going to see in a few more years with what we're talking about in Arizona and Florida, we're going to see if that incentive is driven by competition. So here's a interesting little tidbit about Florida. So in Florida, there's voucher system in Florida where an amount of money is given to students for their education. Parents can use that money in Florida for homeschooling. So I think the amount is somewhere like $9,000 or $10,000 is what the voucher is for. And that money can be used by a parent like me to homeschool your kid. Well, Maryland doesn't have that. If you want to homeschool in Maryland, you're on your own. And in fact, there's a lot of homeschoolers that say that Maryland makes it very difficult to homeschool because they don't want you to homeschool your kid because enrollment is tied to funding. And if you're homeschooled, you're not enrolled in a school, so the school's not getting that funding. But then you have states like Florida that are doing it very differently. And, look at the two states. Where are people moving? Like, which population is growing? Florida's growing. Maryland's stagnant.
Chris, I've learned a lot on this podcast. I appreciate you being here. Where can people follow and support your work and learn more?
Sure, man. Thank you so much. So the book is called Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. As we're talking here right now, it's a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And, I'm really proud of that. And, I'm doing this book tour, and I'm talking to people like yourself because I want people to know what's going on in public education. I want to educate them, if you will, because it's that important. And the public education system, in my view, is the most important institution we have in America because it affects everything else. It affects your home values. It affects your property rates, your crime rates, the quality of your local economy. All of that is tied directly to the quality of your local public education system. And, if people pick up a copy of the book, which is available anywhere, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, Amazon, your local bookstore, if they don't have it, they can certainly order it. Pick up a copy and let me know what you think. I'm really easy to get a hold of. Just Chris Papst, ChrisPapst on Facebook, X, chrispapst.com. Let's continue the conversation because I think that this is the most important topic facing America right now. And we can't allow more school systems like Baltimore to happen. We have to demand higher.
Go check them out in the description down below, everybody. And the show is called Every Day is Friday. And I want to know from you, Chris, what does Every Day is Friday mean to you?
What does Everyday Friday mean to me? I get more joy in my life just being with my kids. So I'm going to go home and I'm just going to spend the evening with them, and I'm going to practice lacrosse with them, and I'm going to practice softball with them, the two sports that they're doing now, and spend as much time with them as I can. And it's my happy place.
Thank you for sharing your stories and experiences today.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
And to everyone out there listening and tuning into the podcast, Every Day is Friday. If you enjoyed this, make sure you follow, share, and keep that Every Day is Friday mindset going. Stay inspired and make every day feel like Friday. Until next time, everybody.